Well, thanks very much both, and I should also thank Bo for the kind invitation to come to Vilnius. I've only been here once before, and that's a number of years ago, but I try to follow Lithuanian and Baltic questions as well as I can, and I'm in contact regularly with colleagues from Lithuania. As a matter of fact, on a research project that I directed for a number of years, we had a visitor who came now and then, a Lithuanian anthropologist who was looking at Lithuanians overseas in terms of their identity and in terms of their, you might say, national identity and the ways of somehow trying to recreate or maintain a national identity when they spent most of their life abroad. So there is a connection. And strangely enough, come to think of it, that research project was called Cultural Complexity in the New Norway, and it was abbreviated CULCOM. Okay, you'll find it if you Google CULCOM. We still have a lot of stuff online, interviews and little articles and links and things. And what we were trying to do, we started up in 2004, and the project ran until 2010. It was interdisciplinary, so it means that it was not just anthropologists. You know, anthropologists tend to be very myopic, you know, short-sighted, okay? Because you look at a tiny bit of reality in a really detailed way, okay? You crawl around on the ground with a magnifying glass and you study the grains of sand, and then you use that knowledge to develop a theory about the world, okay? And of course, for political theorists and macro-sociologists, it's not enough, because they would say that, look, in addition, you also need another kind of social scientist. You need the people in the helicopter who are circling the planet with a pair of binoculars and who can produce statistics and large-scale theories. So we collaborated with those people in the helicopter as well, and also with historians and with theologians and philosophers. And what we were trying to do in this CULCOM project, that Darius, our Lithuanian colleague, had a small bit in, was to develop a new map of Norway, a map which described the territory in a more accurate way. Because the feeling was that this country, the country in which I lived, had changed quite a bit, but school books and quite a bit of, you know, academic research still took as a point of departure Norway in the 1950s or 60s. And lots of things had changed. Not just globalization, which is also a horrible word. You know? I mean, we use it all the time, but it's a horrible word. You know? Because it's an all or nothing word. I mean, it doesn't really describe anything at all, but I'm going to use it quite a few times during this lecture still, because it's a word that is needed. But it's not just globalization, you know, increased travel, increased connections with the outside world, the growth of the internet, etc. That changed or challenged Norwegian identity. But also, I mean, immigration, which has been considerable, and I'm coming to that. I'm going to say a few things about migration and that kind of cultural diversity eventually. How can we develop a national identity in which immigrants from other parts of the world, and not just from Europe, are included, so that they can also feel part of the nation, which has historically been founded on a notion of, you know, history, historical continuity, and to some extent a shared ethnic identity. So how can we somehow redesign a national identity so as to make it more inclusive? And finally, I mean, globalization, okay, increased contact, migration, you know, the growth of a new form of cultural and ethnic diversity. And thirdly, I might mention the relationship with Europe, which in the Norwegian case is a difficult and complicated relationship. You know, Norway has had 2 referendums, okay, about European membership in the European Union, and voted no, with a fairly narrow margin, it must be said. But still, the majority voted no on both occasions. And the way it looks now, I mean, with crisis in Europe and with, I mean, lots of bad things happening here around the continent, it doesn't seem likely that we're going to have a 3rd referendum very soon. But I'm sure there'll be a 3rd referendum, but I don't know if it's going to take place in my lifetime. And I think the result will be 52% no. I'm sorry about that, you know? I mean, I'm one of those few intellectuals in Norway who was pro-Europe in 1994. for a number of reasons, but I don't know. Anyway, so that was the third thing. So in other words, there were lots of things that happened, that somehow changed the territory, and we needed new maps to describe this territory. And part of that map, a small part of that map, was in fact the presence of a Lithuanian community in Norway. But there were lots of other communities, some of them larger, some of them smaller, from other parts of the world, who were more or less settled in the country. Okay, so that is, was just a few words of introduction. Now, identity and globalization. For a long time, social scientists believed that national identities would be weakened, that they would somehow fade away. Already Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, wrote about this around the First World War, how class identities and individual identities would slowly replace the national and ethnic primordial identities as the most important forms of belonging, so that people would increasingly identify not with a nation, not with the national myths, not with the myths of blood and kinship, but with achievements and with a profession. These identities might be transnational. For example, if you're an anthropologist and you have a strong professional identity as an anthropologist, that's really who you are, you know? I mean, we are this sort of small tribe of academics who do research on cultural diversity, okay? That's our job. Diversity is our trade. The outside world. If you're an anthropologist, maybe, according to this view of identity, you would feel when you went abroad and you met other anthropologists that you had more in common with them than you might with your neighbour. Because your neighbour listens to the wrong kind of music, and he votes for the wrong political party, and he eats the wrong kind of food, and he doesn't have your sort of view of the world, okay, and where we're going. So you'd feel that you had more in common with an Australian anthropologist than you would with your neighbour living next door to you. That sort of thinking about identity, which is very familiar, because of course we human beings have lots of forms of identification. I mean, the word identity, just like globalization, is a bit of an empty container, okay? And some would say that identity is a zombie concept. It's undead. It's a zombie concept. That's a good word, the zombie concept, okay? It still walks, but it no longer lives. I disagree, you know, I think we're just like globalization. We're going to need identity as part of our conceptual toolbox for quite some time still, and probably forever. Because it is about groups, and it's about who you identify with, and it's about how you develop a sense of belonging. But the big question is, why is it that some forms of belonging become more powerful than others? Okay. For a long time, as I said, social scientists and quite a few other people believed that national identities would go away because they were so ancient and they were so traditional and they didn't fit in the modern world. How wrong they were. But it's easy for me to say, because I've lived through part of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. But they were very wrong. But there was an optimism associated with modernity, which was also connected to the idea that people could create themselves, you could develop yourself. Around the same time as Max Weber wrote about class differences and individualism and modernity and bureaucracy and that sort of thing, around the same time there was a very popular play that was screened in New York City called The Melting Pot, by a Jewish English immigrant called Israel Zangwill. He was the author of that play, okay, about the melting pot. And the play was really about how all these people who come from all over the place, well, mostly from Europe, but from all parts of Europe, they come into this big city, which is New York, and they somehow, after a few years, they become American. They contribute something to Americanness, new food, you know, new slang expressions, and maybe new styles of clothing and so on, but they become American. So after a number of years, they become as one, the American melting pot, okay? That was an idea, which was very powerful, and remains powerful to some extent in some of those New World countries, like Canada and like the US. You can become American in a way that you probably cannot become Lithuanian or Norwegian. So there is a difference here between countries in the way in which they are capable of absorbing newcomers. But still, a few decades after this play on the melting pot, a number of books written by social scientists were published, and one of them was called The Unmeltable Ethnics. That was around 1960, okay, a few decades later, around 1960. Well, it turned out that the melting pot, well, it didn't really happen, because people who were of Scandinavian origin still considered themselves Scandinavian. They still saw themselves as Norwegian, Swedish, or whatever. And they continued to keep some of their customs and traditions alive. So in other words, this ethnic diversity was really not something that would go away. Well, the answer to, I mean, the final word here is, well, it did go away and it didn't, because really, I mean, third, fourth, fifth generation European immigrants in the United States are American. They may be hyphenated Americans. They may be Norwegian Americans, Lithuanian Americans, Swedish Americans, and so on, but they're still American. And language was usually lost by the third generation. And I think, you know, language is quite important when it comes to identity. It's an important marker of these kinds of collective identities that I'm talking about. But at the same time, they kept up notions about the homeland, about tradition, and they continued, you know, to eat their cod dinners, okay, in Minnesota, in the middle of the continent, where nobody has ever seen a cod. They continued to eat cod at least once a year, in order to somehow in a bodily way, you know, reproduce, as it were, their sense of being Norwegian. So the ethnics were unmeltable. Now, one kind of unmeltable ethnic which was not dealt with in this new literature from the 1960s and 70s was that of African Americans. And one interesting thing, when we think about diversity, assimilation into a national identity, what does it take to be a member of a nation? One interesting thing about this is that if we think about the United States, North America, around the last turn of the century, around the year 1900, when there was massive immigration from many parts of Europe into the US, the message that was conveyed to Europeans was that no matter how much you try to retain your culture, your identity, your sense of not being one of us, we're going to turn you into Americans. You're going to become Americans. But the message given to African Americans who had lived there all their lives, they were the descendants of slaves. Many of them came from families who had been in the US longer than the Anglo-Americans, the dominant group. The message given to the African Americans was the opposite. No matter how much you try, we're never going to allow you to become first-class members of the nation. You can stay and you can work for us, but we're not going to treat you as equals. And 45 years later, 45 years into the new century, the 20th century, the famous Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal was invited to talk and write about race relations in the United States. And he wrote a book called An American Dilemma. This was just after the Second World War. And it was a book about the inability of white America to assimilate, to integrate, and to treat as equals black Americans. So there are issues here, there are problems. And the general problem that I'm sort of getting at, okay, as I'm talking, is the problem of group membership. Because a group, any human group, no matter what kind of group, it could be a group of anthropologists, it could be a group of, you know, Norwegians, Swedes, Lithuanians, whatever. Or a group of people who belong to the same religion. Any group is like an inverted refrigerator, okay? It's an inverted refrigerator. You know, the whole point about a fridge is that it should keep everything inside cold. It should generate coldness inside. But in order to generate that coldness, it almost inadvertently, almost involuntarily, has to generate some heat outwards. You know, it generates a bit of heat. And I know this from experience, because I've lived in what we call a bedsit. You know, I lived in a small room, okay, when I was a student. And I had a fridge. And there were times, at this time of the year, and July, when it was really hot outside, and you wanted it to be sort of as cool as possible. Of course, we don't have air conditioning in Norway. I mean, most of the time, we don't really need it. So I had the window open, and I noticed that the room is a bit warmer than it should be. And that was partly because the fridge produced a bit of warmth. The fridge produced heat. Now with groups, it's the other way around. The whole point about groups is to generate warmth inside, to generate that sort of sense of intimacy, the feeling of belonging and of security, etc. But in order to do so, it has to generate a bit of coldness outwardly. Because there have to be criteria. If you have a proper group, not everybody can be included. You have to have a boundary. And that's the problem. And where do we place that boundary? That is one of the big questions raised in this turbulent age of globalization and migration in relation to national identities. Where do we place the boundary? What's the criteria? What does it take to become a full card-carrying member of a national community? There were other utopian ideas about the end of national identities. And let me just, remind you one, with which you in this part of the world, on this side of the Baltic Sea, are more familiar with than those of us who come from the other part of the Baltic Sea, namely communism. The idea that the communist or socialist identity should somehow supersede nationalism. That it should be, the paramount identity was your sort of class identity, and the national ethnic identities were going to fade away. So you had there was this kind of modernist optimism in socialism as well. And many people in the West believed in this also. One of the last authoritative statements on the end of the nation states was in a book written by the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm in the late 1980s, called Nations and Nationalism in Europe since the 1780s. So he took a sort of a 200-year perspective, okay? From the very beginning of thinking about nationhood in the late 18th century until the late 1980s. And Eric Hobsbawm predicted in that book that national identities would slowly fade away because they no longer had an economic rationale. The idea was that as long as you have a national economy, an economy which is more or less bounded by the nation state, it makes sense to identify with a nation. But as the economy is becoming increasingly globalized, people will find other ways of identifying which will be more important than the nation. So many people agree with this analysis. And another theorist from a sort of a left of center, left-wing background, wrote an extremely influential book about national identity and about its continued importance in the 1980s, namely the Irish historian Irish historian Benedict Anderson. Eric Hobsbawm was born in the Habsburg Empire and became an Englishman. Just like the late Ernest Gellner, who was born just after the end of the Habsburg Empire and also died an Englishman. But Benedict Anderson, in his wonderful, evocative, poetic book, Imagined Communities, first published in 1983, speaks about the emotional power of the nation. It's a very powerful book, and the very metaphor of the imagined community is a very strong one, and it's travelled a lot, and it's been quoted every day in exam papers around the world, and also in articles and books, okay? But unfortunately, many of the people who quote Benedict Anderson on imagined communities, they haven't really read beyond the title of the book, okay? So they would say, the nation is an imagined community, Anderson, 1983. Okay? But had they only read up to page 6, they would have seen that he says that what distinguishes the nation from other imagined communities is the style of imagination. Because all communities beyond the level of face-to-face contact are imagined. And in fact, I would add that even face-to-face contact communities are somehow imagined because they need imagination in order to come into being. So it's the style of imagination that distinguishes the nation. And we can discuss that later on. What kind of imagination is it that distinguishes a nation? There may be a lot to say about that. I won't do it now. But just one thing about Anderson before I move on. Imagined is not imaginary. Okay? Imaginary is something that is made up. It's fictional. It doesn't exist. It doesn't really exist. It's delusional. Whereas imagined just refers to the fact that you have to use your imagination in order for you to imagine all those fellow citizens with whom you are loyal. Because, take a country like Sweden. You live in Malmö. Malmö is a bad example, okay? Because there are issues to do with identity in Skåne, okay? But you live in Göteborg, okay, in Gothenburg, and you've never met this fantastic skier. There's a fantastic athlete, okay, who does cross-country skiing, who's from northern Sweden. Let's say that he's from Haparanda, okay, very near the Finnish border. You've never met him, and at the same time, whenever he skis, whenever he takes part in a race, you cheer for him. You hope that he's going to win because you feel like your family. You identify with people whom you have never met, and you respect you respect political leaders whom you have never met and who come from a place far away because you belong to the same nation. So you might say that nationalism, national identity, represents a very powerful form of metaphoric kinship. It's a form of metaphoric kinship. We're not really related. And if you look closely, you'll find that there's been a lot of mixing. You know, we're mixed a lot with foreigners, all of us. There aren't any pure races, okay, or pure nations. But we still imagine ourselves as belonging to a big kin group. It's a form of metaphorical kinship. And but what I was going to say about Andersen was this, but it was also something else, namely that he says that, you know, he was an historian of Southeast Asia, who's working in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. And he believed in socialism. But then, at a certain point in the 1970s, one socialist country went to war against another. This was the Vietnam-Laos war, which made him realize that national sentiment can be more powerful than ideologies. It can be deeper and it can be more emotional, because a nation is something that you go out and fight and die for, whereas you would be less likely to do the same thing for your trade union, or for your hometown, or for your association of social anthropologists. But you go out and fight and die for the nation, and you're expected to do so, and your death is being celebrated. You become a martyr for the nation. When think about the importance of sacrifice, of blood sacrifice for nationalism. All national mythologies, which are worthwhile looking at, have an element of blood sacrifice. And the people who sacrifice their lives are those who defend the boundaries of the nation. So Andersen then, you know, started to do serious research on nationalism and came to realize that there is something incredibly powerful about it. And he says somewhere, also in the introduction, on the first 10 pages of the book, Imagine Communities, he says something about nationalism is more, has more in common with phenomena like religion and kinship than it does with ideologies such as liberalism or socialism. And I think that's, this is important if we're going to understand the power and the continued power of nationalism. That it's not just a set of ideas that you choose. It's associated with who you are in a much more existential way. And this we have gradually come to understand. But still, some people never learn. And I mean, I was one of them, okay? In the 1990s, globalization really took off. Globalization started to accelerate. Things started to happen really fast in the realm of travel, communication, and mobility, and integration. Remember, this was the time when it was the time just after the end of the Cold War, okay? So there was the opening up of Central and Eastern Europe to open contact with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. It was also a time when we got internet. Early 1990s was when we got internet. We got mobile phones. Mobile phones which somehow changed human relations in ways which we still have only partly understood. The fact that you can somehow carry with you, wherever you go, a mobile sort of communication apparatus that enables you to communicate with anybody, anywhere in the world, at any time. And you can be in Malaysia or in Japan, and it doesn't matter because they phone your number and the phone starts ringing. So we got mobile phones, we got internet, it was the end of the Cold War, and it was also the end in South Africa of apartheid. You know, a racist ideology and practice which excluded the majority of the population from equal rights. So there was this sense in the 1990s of a world which is reshuffling the cards, where the forms of belonging are now totally open. And in 1996, the famous sociologist Zygmunt Bauman said something to the effect that And this is, this is a nice sort of, it captures the zeitgeist of the 1990s really well. When Baumann said that the 20th century project of identity consisted in creating stable and homogeneous national identities. Creating those stable, homogeneous national identities where people felt the same. Okay? But the 21st century project of identity, yes, must consist in avoiding fixation and keeping the options open. Keeping the options open. That was a notion of the late 1990s. How somehow anything could be possible. And I said, I was one of them, okay? I was one of the people who really believed that with the internet and with increased travel and all forms of contact across the world, national identities would be weakened. They probably wouldn't go away, but they would be weakened because in people's experiences, there would be so many other ways of identifying with different kinds of groups. And you would wake up one morning and realize that, bloody hell, if you pardon my French, I have more in common with people I've met in Brazil than I do with people from my own country. Because we listen to the same music and we relate to the same political ideas and we sort of somehow have the same outlook. Why did some of us really believe in this in the 1990s? Well, I mean, one of the reasons was that we had been reading people like Benedict Anderson and others who had written about the conditions for these abstract imagined communities of the nation. I mean, there is one main character. There are two big books about nationalism. Oh, they're not very big. They're actually both quite small, but they're two very influential books in recent theory about nationalism that people tend to return to when they look into nationalism. One of them is Ernest Gellner's book, Nations and Nationalism, from 1983, and the other one is Benedict Anderson. And in Gellner's book, which I'm not going into here, there is one main sort of protagonist, okay? There's a main character in that book, and that character is the Industrial Revolution. To him, it was the Industrial Revolution that created national identities, that replaced those sort of old local primordial identities which were much more parochial because they were attached to places and not to large countries. In Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, there's also a main character or a protagonist, which is the printing press and the revolution of the print, what he calls print capitalism. How people in Malmö or in Göteborg, they would be exposed to exactly the same texts and the same school books as people in northern Sweden, and would thereby gradually develop lots of shared ideas about the world in spite of the fact that they had never met and would never meet. So our reasoning in the 1990s was that, okay, if the printing press and national radio and national television creates national identities, what then happens when we get transnational or multinational cable TV and the internet enabling you to communicate across the world as a replacement for this sort of national frame provided by the printing press and national newspapers and literature and so on. So it wasn't it wasn't just wishful thinking, okay, and it wasn't just wild imaginative thought, but given that the traditional media of the 20th century would be replaced by other media which were transnational, it made sense to think that the national identities would be weakened to the benefit of others. But then we started to do some serious research on this. What does the internet do to national identities? And paradoxically, and very interesting and very fun for us, I mean, what we started to find out very soon was that exactly the opposite happened from what we thought. For one thing, the internet, it strengthened kinship connections. Kinship became more important, or rather people who were relatives often became more closely connected through the internet because they could communicate much more often. And this was especially the case with transnational communities, people who were living in different countries. They could communicate instantaneously and cheaply. And secondly, the internet did not really weaken national identities, but in some cases, in fact, it strengthened national identities. I mean, let me just give you one example, which is not from this part of the world, okay, but I'm coming to this part of the world very soon. I just have to keep an eye on the time. Okay? Oh. Not doing too well. So when Trinidadians came to America and started to study, and they realized that people in America only had the vaguest ideas about the Caribbean, and they thought that people out in the Caribbean, they lie around in hammocks and they drink rum all the time, you know, and they dance, you know, to calypso music, okay? And it's an easygoing, relaxed lifestyle. Whereas in fact Trinidad is a very industrial, fast-paced place, very urbanized place. So they were shocked, and they started to set up websites presenting Trinidad, largely to foreigners, to explain to them that, look, I mean, Trinidad is a place where steel-bound music was invented, you know. We have some of the finest literary authors in the world, including V.S. Naipaul and so on. So they started to advertise Trinidad. In other words, it strengthened their national identity to come online. And we come across lots of counterintuitive, paradoxical experiences and findings when we do serious research on what new technologies do to the contemporary world. So in other words, when we had European elections just a little while ago, and there was this swing to the right, which has been commented upon by journalists and commentators across the continent in a very worried tone. People are very worried. What's going on? There is nothing new about this. We saw the resurgence of ethnicity in America in the 1960s, right? And you saw the resurgence of nationalism in Southeast Asia in the 1970s. And we even saw that, well, multi-channel TV and the internet they did not do away with national identity, and in fact in some cases they might have strengthened it. So there's nothing new about this. There is something frightening about what's going on in Europe, but there's nothing new. It shouldn't be surprising that national identities develop in this way. And there's another thing about these national identities that now re-emerge and that we see somehow the traces of in the results of the European elections. And that is another principle of identity. I mentioned the inverted refrigerator. Another principle is the one that I call Simmel's rule, after the German sociologist Georg Simmel, who wrote about this, I mean, around the First World War. And Simmel's rule, at least in my recollection of it, it goes like this. It's very simple and very useful, okay? When we think about identities in groups, that sort of dynamic. The strength of a group's integration depends on the external pressure. That's it, you know. The strength of integration depends on external pressure. In other words, if you feel that your identity is continuously being threatened, someone doesn't recognize you, they want to obliterate you, they want to eat you up, they want you to be like them, or even worse, they want to kill you, okay? And they're encroaching on you, they're filling up your country with their filthy religion and stupid food, you know? That sort of thing. You have to defend yourself, because they're coming after me. So in other words, Simmel's rule is very, and it says something about this part of the world, which I'm coming to in half a minute. But in other words, it says that group identities are stronger when a group feels challenged or threatened from the outside. And this means that if you are a woman and you feel that the main source of your oppression, the reason that you're not getting anywhere is men, okay? You become a feminist and you associate with other women and you stress that all women are sisters because we all live under universal patriarchy. Okay? Or if you have a Marxist persuasion, you would think about the world in terms of people who own property and people who don't own property. Okay? People who reap capital and people who produce that capital for them, the surplus value. So you would think in terms of class. But if you come from a small, fragile ethnic group or nation, you become obsessed with nationhood in an era of globalization. Or at least that's one option. I'm not saying that's the only one, but it's one very simple and very obvious option. That when you feel that we are losing ourselves in this sea of cosmopolitan, globalizing, Americanizing, homogenization, we're losing our own roots, we're losing our sense of who we are. We need to strike back. And the way in which people strike back can be different ways, and we've seen one of those ways in the recent European elections. And Simmel's rule also tells us something else, because when is the pressure being felt most strongly? Well, it's being felt most strongly if you come from a small group. So small groups tend to have a stronger group identity than large groups. I mean, all other things being equal. Everybody knows, I mean, they certainly do now, but they even did 10 or 20 years ago, what it is to be Scottish. But hardly anybody can tell you what it is to be English. Everybody knows what it's like to be Norwegian, because Norway still has an identity as a post-colonial country, which still strives to invent itself, or to create and define what it is to be Norwegian. Because we still define ourselves relationally, in spite of all the oil and all the money and all the stuff that's happened, we still define ourselves in relation to the neighbours, in relation to Sweden and Denmark. The Swedish identity is very different, because Sweden has a majority identity, whereas Norway has a minority identity. And this is why people talk less about national identity, and there's less of this nationalist enthusiasm, okay, you might say, in Sweden. It's an underlying, it's an implicit thing, Swedish national identity. It's taken for granted. And Swedes can take national identity for granted because they've had a nation state for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, we have to remember this, that, and it would be interesting, I'm not up to it here, but maybe someone here can do it, to do the same thing for the 3 Baltic states, which have so different histories. You have this very ancient Lithuanian history, you have the very recent Estonian history. And in Scandinavia, if you take the 3 Scandinavian countries, you'll quickly discover that, well, here we have 2 of the oldest nation states in Europe and 1 of the youngest. A country in which the very fact of having an independent nation is still a sort of a fragile thing. It's something that is being threatened and something that has to be protected. So here we are with some of this internal diversity in Scandinavia, and we could extend that to the Baltic area as well. That you have different perceptions of who you are. And so Simmel's rule would work differently in these 3 cases. And I'd like now to just say something general first, and then move on a bit more, okay, about, and we can return, I think we should return, and probably during discussion, to the shift to the right in European politics, and what that signifies, and what it says about national identity. Does it say anything about national identities being threatened, or is there something else? I think it says something about polarization, that countries are increasingly becoming divided, and quite deeply so. And I'll return to that in a short while, okay? Just to announce the final part of the lecture. But now, how do we respond to globalization, given what I've said about the dynamics of identity, and about the inverted refrigerator, about the deep sort of kinship-like character of nationalism when it works, and about Simmel's rule. What you could say about identity in an era of globalization is that there is another paradox here. I mean, I mentioned a few paradoxes, and the paradox is runs like this, okay? Because of the forces of globalization, and when we speak English, for example, as a foreign language, because of the forces of globalization, we all become more similar. I mean, and that's how it is, you know? I mean, you travel somewhere, and it's still fun to travel, but it's not exotic in the way it was, you know, in the 1980s when I was young, okay, when I was a student. And you went to Italy, and people didn't understand English, they had a different currency, I mean, everything was a bit, you know, different, the way of life was so different. You went into shops and they had different goods, you know, you didn't recognize any of the chocolates, you know. And you tried to smoke Italian cigarettes, and so on, everything was a bit different. Whereas things become more and more homogenized. So when we now travel, you expect somehow to find the same kinds of consumption goods, consumer goods on offer everywhere. It's what the the American sociologist George Ritzer speaks of as McDonaldization, the McDonaldization of society. And he's also written about this in terms of globalization in a very entertaining book. A nice book. I'm not sure if it's a good book, but it's a nice book called The Globalization of Nothing. And nothing is that sort of stuff that makes us the same. Stuff that could be anywhere. Okay? You know what I'm talking about. So because of the forces of globalization, we all become more similar. But the more similar we try to be, the more similar we become, the more different we try to be. Because this production of similarity produces a sort of a frenzied need to be different. we're unique, we're rooted, we're authentic, we're real. So that in my country, in Norway, there's been an enormous growth, there's been enormous spread in folk dresses in the last 20, 25 years. Exactly in the same period as Muslim women across the world have started to wear the hijab. You know, the headscarf, the Muslim headscarf, which they didn't do before. They didn't care about that before. There was no reason for them to do. Everybody knew that they were Muslim. Whereas nowadays, there's a heightened sensitivity about who you are and where you're from. So what they tell you when they wear the folk dress in Norway is that, yes, we live in a postmodern world, and yes, we are very Americanized, and whatever that means. And we, you know, we watch American TV programs, and we use computers and that sort of thing, and we sort of travel a lot. But we haven't forgotten who we are and where we're coming from. And for Norwegians, that's a nation. And for many Muslims, it's religion. Now, this is a simplified version of the analysis, you realize this, but I think it's an important part of it. So in other words, because of globalization, we all become more similar. Because of this similarity, the more similar we become, the more different we try to be. But the final part, and that's the paradox, is that the more different we try to be, the more similar we become. Same ways. I mean, there's an emerging global grammar of producing difference. I mean, of course, the content is unique. I mean, in Hawaii, you have the flower garlands and, you know, the Hawaii guitar, which was invented by a German in California, but it's still Hawaiian, okay? It became Hawaiian. And the Polynesian culture and Polynesian food and so on. So everybody has their own content, but the grammar of producing cultural difference and communicating it to the outside world is uniform. It's the same, because we have to find a way of telling everybody else how unique we are, and we need a shared language for telling each other how unique we are. Right? So in a way, ethnicity, ethnic relations, is a kind of way in which we try to make cultural differences comparable. And in order to do that, we have to become more similar. We have to find a shared language for talking about difference. So that's one way of thinking about the production of difference. There are many different ways in which this can work itself out in politics. The yearning among some, not among everybody, but the yearning to remain unique and to defend your uniqueness, as it were. For example, one phenomenon which was described, and I tried to market this in northern Norway back in 1994. It didn't help. Which was described already in the 1970s, was something called the Shetlands effect. You know, the Shetland Islands, north of Scotland, part of Scotland, part of the United Kingdom, and the people in the Shetlands, they didn't care much for Scottish dominance, nor do they now, in fact, now that they're facing referendum. So they went to London in order to use London against Edinburgh, right? Because London was a more powerful political centre. So the Shetlands effect is about aligning yourself with someone far away in order to use them, as it were, and to get their assistance against your closer enemy or your closer leaders. And I tried to market this in northern Norway, talking to the Sami, Sami people, saying, look, I mean, it would be a good idea for Sami to join the European Union, because then you could use Brussels against Oslo. Right? Because Brussels, and at the time Brussels had a more progressive minority policy than Oslo. But it didn't help. They massively voted no. Anyway, so this is so there are many ways in which this can work itself out politically. But what I'd like to focus on now, and what I hope we can discuss when the time comes to discussion. Now I've gone through some of the paradoxes of identity, the resilience of the nation, but still, I mean, there are still brave academics who predict the demise, the end of the nation, and the end of the nation state. I mean, there was a book came out just a couple of years ago called After the Nation. But in the end, the editors put a question mark. But still, it's called After the Nation, and it's about these alternative forms of identity that are emerging in a hyper-complex world, which is in some ways on the move. If not physically, at least culturally, it's moving. There are so many ways in which you can belong, and yet we come back to nations, or to ethnic groups, or whatever that is. But I'd like to say that one sort of, and again, I mean, we'll talk more about this part of the world afterwards, and about the Baltic states and the Nordics, and about their similarities and differences. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say, and you'll have a lot to say about that. But let me now just phrase it in more general terms. And I'm going to use an example from my own country, from Norway, to illustrate what's going on. And my persuasion, I think, my conviction, is that in the 21st century, it is simplistic. It's too simple to talk about a mere, as it were, return to national identities, a fear of globalization. After the optimism of the 1990s, we got the terrorist attacks on 9/11. We got a number of, you might say, backlashes. You had the backlash of multiculturalism, where people around Europe started to discover that, as a matter of fact, multiculturalism could be a bad idea for many. You know, to having this kind of radical cultural diversity, which is associated with multiculturalism, probably not a good idea for women, for example, and maybe not for others. So we had a number of these sort of backlashes, but it's more complicated than this. And I would say that my main conviction is that we have a situation of polarization. Not so much a polarization around the nation state as such, which still enjoys a fair amount of support. But it's an old thing, you know, that the nation state should have so much support, because nation states are so different in scale. I mean, for people in Dominica, which is a Caribbean island, 70,000 is perfect. You know, 70,000 people is perfect. It's a perfect size for society, because then you actually know the Prime Minister's cousin, you know? So you have direct access, okay, to the leaders. People in France, even intellectuals in France, would say, I mean, they might say things such as, well, in order to have a real nation, in order to have a real nation, you've got to have at least 50 million, because then, only then can you have the kind of diversity that you need in order to have a vibrant intellectual life. And you have, you know, different publishers and, you know, all kinds of music and a variety of food and so on. Only with 50 million can you have a proper nation. Whereas I think in Norway, people feel that 5 million is perfect, right? For a nation. More than 5 million, it would be very alienating. So it's odd that in spite of this huge discrepancy in size, and also in national ideologies regarding ethnic diversity and so on, that the idea of the nation still has, I mean, and probably will continue to have strong support. And it has probably something to do with the state, that the state somehow, it is, I'm not going to say whether it's a good or a bad idea, but it condenses a lot of power, and it also condenses a lot of identity into one sort of principle, one political principle, which is also a cultural principle of belonging. But this is where the consensus ends. I mean, the United Kingdom is an interesting case these days, but it was never a nation state. You know, the United Kingdom was never a nation state. It was an imperial state. British was not a national identity, it was an imperial identity. And after empire was lost, there has been a continuous crisis of identity in the United Kingdom, which we now see with the possible independence of Scotland, and with the ongoing conflict in Ireland. But the polarization is so the polarization in most nation states, and I'd say probably the Baltics and the Nordics, nobody questions the state as such, but they question the content. What kind of nation is this? And as many of you know, I mean, there are two sort of main principles of nationhood. One of them being the ethno-cultural nationhood. It's ethnic or it's cultural or it's both, and it emphasizes history and shared origins. And the other one is the idea of the civic nation, the nation that was championed after the French Revolution in France, where you don't become a member of the nation by virtue of having the same ancestors as other people, but by virtue of living in the same country. So you become French by living in France. That was the idea of le citoyen. Le citoyen doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily a descendant of les Gaulois, you know, but the citoyen is someone who lives in France and who's committed to living in France. I mean, and look at, I mean, now we have World Cup football, okay? I mean, I'm sure that at least a handful of you follow it a bit, okay? And look at the French national team. It's been like this for more than 20 years. I mean, half of it is West African somehow, or Caribbean, and the other half is North African. and there may be Basque or Breton, so it's quite interesting that this is, and it made Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of the present right-wing leader in France, it made him exclaim in 1998 when they won the World Cup. The French team, for the first time in history, won the World Cup. He said, "C'est pas une équipe française. It's not the French team," because there were hardly any white Frenchmen on it. So, in other words, you have civic and cultural nationalism, and I say that in Western Europe, and certainly in Scandinavia, not so much here. I think here debates are more about the interpretation of history. What are the lessons to be learned from history? But certainly in Scandinavia, the main controversy is about the way in which we deal with these two notions of nationhood. I mean, now let me just take one example from Norway to illustrate the dilemma. As you would know, about 3 years ago, we had a horrible terrorist attack in Norway where 77 people were killed and many others were injured. And it all happened in one afternoon. And there was just one man behind it, a deluded right-wing extremist, okay, who hated Muslims and social democrats. And he hated quite a few other people as well, but that doesn't matter. But the point is that his vision, the terrorist vision, was an ethnically pure Norway. He wanted to cleanse it of all this foreign filth, get the Muslims out, and black people, and people who are not descendants of Vikings. In other words, an extreme expression of a notion, a concept of the nation, associating it with ethnic purity. The nation is ethnic. And the Social Democrats, the Labour Party in particular, I mean, he was wrong in this because Conservatives have been, well, they are slightly less liberal now, but they haven't been more liberal in the past. But the Labour Party have betrayed the nation by allowing all these foreigners in. A few years before this terrorist attack, which highlighted the polarization of the country, right, between those who can perfectly well live with diversity. We say that, yeah, I mean, people who have a different background can become Norwegian, and especially they can become Norwegian by acquiring citizenship, by learning the language, and through their children who become members of full card-carrying members of Norwegian society. So you have that on the one hand, and those who feel that, no, in order for this nation to fulfill its historical destiny, it has to be ethnically pure. And contrast this terrorist attack with a speech given by a foreign minister at the time, a few years earlier, Jonas Gahr Støre, who was a rather sort of cosmopolitan person, but also very committed to the idea of Norway, but who had a very different idea of what Norway was. Støre went into a mosque and gave a speech which became fairly well known. I had a student who actually analysed that speech in her master's thesis, so I know it quite well, called A New and Larger We. A New and Larger We, where he talks about refashioning. It's almost as if he had read the web pages of our research program, and maybe he had, I don't know. We felt a bit flattered because we felt that he was onto some of the same ideas that we were, where he argued that in the 21st century, a nation has to be capable of including people who were not born there, who do not have the same history, but who share some of the same values. And of course the big question is, what are those shared values? Point being that it is not origins, it's something else. Now at the end, just to start off the discussion, what I'm saying is that societies are deeply polarized. It's too simple to say, for example, that the United Kingdom have had a swing to the right through the success of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. It's too simple because far more than half the population voted for other parties and are deeply unhappy with the kind of ideology that is represented by UKIP. But still there is a change. You know, in the 1980s, when the Front National in France had 4% of the votes, my friends in France were very worried. They said that, you know, this is very disconcerting, that 4% of the French vote for that kind of party, which is so suspicious and bigoted and racist and so on. But I mean, the figures now are between 20 and 25%. So yes, there has been a shift. But let me just, I mean, at the end, maybe we can talk about this polarization during discussion, but let me posit something that could be unifying for these diverse countries in the future. Because yes, we are diverse. And even if we're not ethnically diverse, we're diverse in other ways. For example, because we have different ideas about where we're coming from and where we're going. That is the result of education. We should be happy about that, because we're highly educated people now. We can have our own opinions. So we would differ in our views on the past and the future. So in other words, yes, they are polarized, and we are different. And they're not going to fool us into believing that we are the same. So perhaps one place to start, if you want to create a unified national identity and keep it going in a situation where people in fact increasingly don't have that much in common. Maybe one place to start would be by looking for the right kinds of symbols. The right kinds of symbols. National symbols, you see, national symbols. In order for national symbols to work, they must be fairly empty. If they're full of meaning, they will be divisive rather than uniting. I mean, a flag can work well, depending on how it looks, because different people can associate different things with a flag. And since I lunched with my Swedish colleague here earlier today, it made me think about my own childhood in the 1970s, when Norwegians were not very nationalist. We wanted progress and development. And most of all, we wanted to be Swedish. You see? Because Sweden had, we just had a lot of fish. Okay? And we weren't poor. I mean, that's a myth that Norway was poor before the oil. We weren't poor. We were doing all right. We were doing just fine. We were just not quite as rich as the Swedes. And they were more glamorous, you see, because we just had a lot of fish. And they had, they had Volvo and Saab and ABBA and Björn Borg, and so they had everything that we wanted. But at the time, Björn Borg, who was the world's best tennis player, which is a big sport with lots of money, he never became, at the time, a national symbol for Sweden. He's now becoming a sort of ambassador for Stockholm, I see, but never became a national symbol for Sweden because he had too much content, so he was controversial. There were lots of scandals involving Björn Borg, with fast cars and women, and there were rumors of cocaine, and he was a tax refugee in Monaco. And good Swedish Social Democrats could never forgive him for that. Whereas Ingmar Stenmark became a national symbol. Ingmar Stenmark, who was an alpine skier, the slalom specialist, and he was also the best in the world, in his discipline. But it was a smaller sport with less money than tennis. And the point about Stenmark was that he was an empty signifier. He didn't have that kind of substance. He was just a guy from rural Sweden who was frightfully good at skiing. And whenever he was asked the question by a journalist, he hardly had anything to say at all. He just answered in sort of one syllable. When the journalist asked Ingmar Stenmark, how the hell can you go so fast down these hills? Do you have any advice for young people? And he would say, "Nej, det var åk." No, you just run, No, you just run. So, in other words, he was a perfect national symbol because he didn't have all that substantial content. So that's one way of holding people together, is by producing or supporting symbols which are sufficiently open for many people who come from different places to see different things in them and still feel the same. Okay, on that note, I think I should end.